Welcome to AHDB Agronomy Week 2020. The live stream session will start shortly. Before we begin, we wanted to remind you of a few points of housekeeping. You're all on mute, so don't worry, we can't hear you. The session is scheduled to last between 1 and 1.5 hours, including questions. We want this session to be as interactive as possible, so please post your questions throughout the session using the live Q&A function in the Agronomy Week platform below. We're recording this session, so if you miss anything or would like to watch it again, it will be available on the AHDB YouTube channel and AHDB website. You can also come back and watch the recordings on the Agronomy Week platform for 3 months. At the end of the session, we'll provide you with unique BASIS and NROSO codes. Don't forget to complete the BASIS and NROSO forms using the relevant tabs on the platform. You have 2 weeks after the live session to register for your points. Join in the conversation online. Follow AHDB_cereals and AHDB_potatoes on Twitter and use the hashtag AgronomyWeek. If you have any issues with the conference platform, there are digital event FAQs in the menu on the left-hand side. You can use the Help tab to contact the team if you experience any technical problems during the week. We hope that you enjoy Agronomy Week 2020. Thanks for joining us. Your session will now start.
Good morning. Welcome to Agronomists Induction. I'm Anne Stone, Knowledge Transfer Manager in AHDB Potatoes. I used to be responsible for 2 spot farms and vividly remember a field event of one of them. The Strategy Director for AHDB asked a question aimed at agronomists. A highly experienced and respected agronomist gave his opinion, and then there was silence. Afterwards, I asked a chatty young agronomist about that silence. She pointed at the older man and said, "He's God." We couldn't say anything different from someone with all that knowledge. Now, I'm sure the seniors in your companies would like you to hang on their every word, and doing so might save you from embarrassing mistakes. But at the same time, you need to be open to possibilities for disruptive change in our industry. We anticipate they will happen during your careers. Today's presentation is more about attitude to change than about specific technologies, although some potential ones will be referred to. Our presenter today, Claire Hodge, is the Senior Knowledge Exchange Manager for the arable sector in Scotland. She applied for and was awarded a Nuffield scholarship on connectivity in the seed potato supply chain, which involved her in interesting travel. Claire will tell you about some of her experiences abroad, but also more than that. An aim of the scholarship is for the person to reflect on the implications of what they've seen abroad, and we hope you can benefit from some of those reflections today. Claire?
Good morning, Anne. Thank you for that introduction. So thank you for that. I'm just going to spend the next hour kind of talking about my Nuffield scholarship and what I learned. And I suppose as kind of age of background, my career started at Greenvale and I was a field person and learned a lot of agronomy, field production, understanding kind of that connection to the supermarkets as we worked with the pack house. And then as my career's progressed, I've worked with loads of agronomists, researchers with AHDB and working with farmers across mostly Scotland now. I applied for a scholarship with Nuffield 2 years ago because I could see that although we're doing a really good job, and Scotland is perceived as being some of the high health status for seed, I wanted to understand how we took this forward and what was the future for the industry that I worked in and loved working in so much. So this is a question I posed: how can we improve the connectivity in the seed supply chain, and where would this take us? So I'm going to talk about the journey I went on and some of the questions that now resonate with me, and I look forward to working with the whole industry and working together to answer them. I certainly didn't come back with all the answers. I probably came back with a lot more questions, but that's probably the fun part. So my slides are a bit slow. So today's session, I'm going to go through challenging the norm and new approaches to potato production. I'm going to look at how the supply chain works. I'm going to talk you through the countries I visited and kind of why I visited them and what the relevance was. I'm going to look a little bit into the environment and how potatoes connect with the environment that we operate in, look at the markets, and then finally some of the technology and some of the questions that came from the technology I saw demonstrated while I travelled around. So supply chain theory, I suppose, as I've mentioned, I've worked with lots of people throughout the supply chain, but often you could see things that worked and things that didn't work, and relationships that were strong throughout the supply chain, seed growers that were well connected to ware growers, scientists that really understood how the soil operated when you put a harvester through it. But I wanted to understand what was it that was working well, not just that these were people who integrated well and talked well. It was what was behind that success and what was happening in there. So I went back to look at supply chain theory. I'm going to start with a question because I'm going to try and understand. I'd like this session to be as interactive as possible. I know it's not so easy while we're on a virtual platform, but if you could answer these questions, we're going to do a bit of a break throughout the 5 sections. So if you could please ask yourself this question: which comes first in potato production? Where does the supply chain start? So is that with the consumer? Is it with the research that comes into the potato production? Is it seed production, or is it the soil? And if you take a moment to answer. So I don't know if I can tell how many people have polled. Either there's... I'll leave it for a couple more seconds. Oh, here we go. We've got some more coming through.
It does take a bit of thinking about this one. Because you look at the soil and it's so important, but on the other hand, if nobody plants anything in it,
yeah, they do. Yeah.
Research alone won't get us anywhere.
It's interesting. No one's put a seed yet.
Perhaps that's because they know that you're most interested in the seed side of things. Don't you feel, Claire, that it all begins with tissue culture, the start of a new variety?
Yeah, I mean that's a really important part of seed production, and where does that seed come from, and how do you get those new varieties there? Yeah, so and I think it's really interesting because we do the Next Generation programme, don't we, Anne? And when we bring people up to Scotland to see how the tissue culture is produced, and the centre at SASA who manages those seed stocks, it's quite an eye-opener, isn't it? Because lots of people don't consider those early generations and the processes that go through.
No, and if we stick with only the varieties we've had from the past, the whole industry would inevitably decline.
Yeah,
it might be slow.
Imagine if we were still using some of the old varieties. The Commonwealth seed collection at James Hutton is really interesting because you see how some of the really old genetics, you don't even get potatoes from them. You don't get tubers.
Oh.
Will we close the poll? Have we got everybody in? Oh, I didn't capture the stats. So we got it. Oh wow, brilliant. So we need the land to produce, so that's the starting point. Antonia will be pleased with your soil session last week.
That's right, it's crucial. But we are all part of a supply chain. And I hear a lot of negative things from each part of the supply chain about other parts, which are always blamed for the reason that progress can't be made. In fact, it seems as if the links below somebody in the supply chain and above them are always the unreasonable ones that block progress.
Yeah, the perceived bottleneck within that chain, yeah, and what's holding back process. Because often it's interesting if you think about varieties as well, is when, especially on PCN, it's not being able to get the varieties that are resistant to PCN into supermarkets. So it's changing the consumer perception and drive in what we can actually access, and I suppose in terms of genetic breeding as well.
Yes. Is that inevitable, or is a more holistic view possible?
I hope that I think we've got a consumer that is more and more engaged and interested. So I think we will end up with a more integrated chain. And I'll move on to my slides and show you a little bit of a diagram of how I've thought this through. So really, there is no answer to this one. It's just to capture people's opinion. And as I say, I'll show you the diagram that I've put together to understand the supply chain. So here we go, the potato supply chain. I think it's really important that we understand where we sit within that chain, and often the supply chain is considered to be linear, so it starts at one point and finishes at another. But I think the role of us all is to try and connect, especially as an agronomist, is trying to connect the consumer, the retailer, the processor, the weigher or processing grower, seed growers, mini tuber production, interconnected with science. And actually broader than just potatoes, because the land that we use, the water resources that we have, are all integrated with each other. So it's that importance of starting to, rather than thinking linear processes, thinking of circular systems that we operate in. I often, I'll come back to this diagram later on, but I often think of it, especially when you think of seed production, the amount of skill, the knowledge, the expertise, the patience that goes into producing such a quality product is absolutely, it's quite humbling actually to think of so much goes into it. And I don't think it's the role of the consumer to be aware of what's behind that, but how many consumers or even how many people within the chain understand that full picture of what goes in to get that product there onto a plate. So this was me trying to understand what's the theory behind that and how does the chain work. And often we talk about, especially in farming, it's how do farmers actually get money back from the system and how is that pulled together. So I started to study, and it was a textbook by Samuel Danny who looked at food supply chains. And the Kraljek's theory is what really resonated with me. And this is a way of looking at how the supply chain operates, putting supply risk against supply profit. And then it gives you 4 areas of items that you can produce. In this example, we think about items that you could produce or need on the farm. So a non-critical transactional item, a more generic, open kind of way of looking at this. A non-critical item would be something like your stationery. It's not going to make much impact to your business, especially not on profit, and it's not a very great supply risk, because if you can't get hold of it, it doesn't really matter. And then there's 2 tactical sections in this matrix. So you've got the leverage items. So I kind of have thought of that as being your input costs, like your sprays and your chemicals or your fertilizers. It can be high cost and it will make an impact on your business bottom line. But it tends to be quite low supply risk, and except for some specialist products, but you can always kind of find an alternative. You're not completely stuck in terms of the risk that's associated to it. Then you've got your bottleneck items. I'm going to use the example because it's kind of front of mind at the moment, but we wouldn't have imagined that toilet rolls would have been a bottleneck item, because you can't just suddenly produce more of it. Because the factories are set up to produce as much as they do, and it's really difficult to get more. So your bottleneck items would be things that would restrict your supply, but normally quite low cost. And then your strategic items. So this is where I think every potato farmer should be positioning themselves as being a strategic partner and a strategic relationship in that supply chain. It tends to be a small number of suppliers that will have a very close working relationship with the buyer. This is based on transparency, joint communication and sharing of operational information. The supplier has sufficient power in this relationship. And I think it's really important that, especially as an agronomist, is that you understand the power and the importance of what a strategic relationship means, because in here it's all about sharing of information and transparency. And often the roles, whether you're working for one of the, as I did, I worked for a pack house, or whether it is you work for an agronomy company, or if you're independent, you are part of that process of sharing information, transparency, and making sure that you can react to information that's coming from one part of the sector. So if you're getting information back from a pack house, pack out details, quality control, any of that information, being able to channel that and transition it into action on the farm as quickly as possible is so important. So you are part of that strategic relationship, because you're providing transparency and interpretation of information, which is so valuable to be able to empower businesses to move forward. And I'd hope that all farmers felt that they were producing a strategic item and pushed forward to be in strategic relationships. But agronomists definitely play their role in making sure that that can happen. And so I think we should be constantly thinking about what information can we provide and how can we translate that into something useful. So lecture over on supply chains, but certainly do, I think it's something to keep going back to, and I'll mention it later on as well. Where are the countries I went to? So I'm going to do another quiz now, just to make sure you're all still with me. So if you can consider, rank the world's top producers of potatoes by volume. So order from 1 being the highest and 5 being the lowest. So which country do you think produces the most potatoes around the world? I've used 2017 figures, and I know they fluctuate a little bit, but that would be kind of the common trend, the figures I've used. So we'll open the poll. And also we welcome questions, so keep bringing questions in, because it'd be quite nice to do them as we go through.
Yes, I didn't say that at the beginning, but all questions in any way related to this presentation. It's a broad field, and I think Claire's fit to answer on a whole range of subjects. What's surprising here, I suppose, most of all with these countries, is they don't include those from South and Central America, where the potato evolved. You'd imagine that's the area best suited to the crop, and yet they're not among the top producers today.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's because they don't rely so much on processed product, because they continued that heritage of kind of fresh potatoes. So volumes perhaps aren't as high. Oh, wow.
Those people who haven't made a stab at this, I'm afraid people might be looking up on Google, and isn't really the idea. It's to
no cheating.
Russia's certainly a very big country, but much of it is not conducive to potato production.
Yeah. I think they eat per head, they eat quite a lot of potatoes, don't they?
Right, well now.
Wow. We close it and
close it and tell us what
and the answers. I wasn't expecting this one. So the answers are actually China, India, Russia, Ukraine, and the USA. And then your volumes. I mean, China is so far ahead here at 99 million tons. India at 49, 30 with Russia, Ukraine 22, USA 20. And Poland at times has been quite high on that list, but it doesn't feature at the moment. And then obviously we all know the UK is operating about 5 million tons. So most of this is to do with population and the need for, well, just the need for food. And China has definitely pushed that diversity in terms of crops and reducing the reliance on rice.
If you look at quantities here, it makes our production look tiny by comparison. But does it matter if villagers in China and India are growing loads of potatoes in traditional ways and it doesn't enter world trade? Does that affect us?
It doesn't affect our production, but it affects our opportunities. So there's loads of opportunities that come with being able to trade with these countries, and a lot of that's looking at seed and innovation. And some of the things I think is really interesting about innovation, and we were talking about this, weren't we, Anne, about how if we're not careful, and I've read a little bit about this as well, is that we could be leapfrogged by some of these developing countries or countries that are pushing forward in increasing their professionalism in potato production. And some of our biggest assets is having research on our doorstep and having researchers that are kind of tackling our issues, and we can trial and pilot innovation on our doorstep and work with researchers and scientists. And if we end up not connected to those markets who will be driving forward a lot of the technology and innovation, we could be left behind. So I think it's important to understand what's happening in these countries. I had some interesting conversations about no-till potatoes, and in India they're all up for it, whereas here we're struggling to get our head around the opportunities and potential. So I think it's really important to see what's happening, what technology is being used in these countries as well. Mini tuber production in China is phenomenal. Like, I think it costs about 50 pence to produce a mini tuber in the UK, whereas it costs around, I mean, don't quote me on that price if you're looking for prices of mini tubers, but around about that price, whereas it's pence, the mini tuber production in China, because it's so vast and its scale. It's one to watch.
So are you going to tell us something about the countries you've been to and what technologies
I'll give you a run
use?
through what's happening in the countries I went to and show you where I went. So this is this is really difficult to kind of capture, but I really like this Rabobank map, which shows what's going on in potatoes around the world. And I think we often think that I work in Scotland, you work in East Anglia, and that's the kind of hub of potatoes, and you do Earlies in the southwest. But ultimately, it's a really vibrant network and a vibrant trade. And I really like how this image captures what's happening around the world and what's going on. And potatoes are really important as a food source, and we're part of something just much bigger and really exciting that we can tap into and learn from. So here we go. We look at UK production. We're fairly static, and a lot of the fluctuations tend to be around weather or climate. It doesn't tend to be around changes in demand, although obviously we've had real big disruption this year, and that puts a change in kind of processing to where. But ultimately, as industry and farmers, there isn't much of change in terms of active reduction or active increase in production. And the travels, where did I go to? I've been to a few places that, like, with my job, I've looked at Europe production systems, and a while ago I got the opportunity to look at potato systems in Australia as a scholarship through the RASC. And so I wanted to look at systems that weren't the same as ours. I wanted to look at the kind of diversity of emerging markets, and I'll talk through the emerging markets, which were kind of Chile, Kenya, Brazil and India, and then also comparing that to the USA, UK and EU. I'll kind of talk through the countries I went to, but really it was looking at emerging markets that weren't particularly complicated, and they were new and they were fresh and they were embracing technology, compared to really complex, multi-level, multi-tier food systems as we get in the UK and America. And I wondered if I'd be able to see something a bit more refreshing in comparison, or see what was working and what maybe we could learn from others of these countries. So as a bit of a kind of headlines of what's going on, India has limited access to more progressive varieties, but has the second biggest production of potatoes behind China, and they will to scope growth to its large population. Push-pull situation in India is interesting. So is it population growth or is it production, and what will come first? Because they've got people who want potatoes, but also a lot of the land is used for rice and wheat. There's obviously, I went to the Global Potato Conclave, and there's real kind of push for a government to introduce policy that favours the potato. At the moment in the Punjab, water access is actually subsidised, and you get a subsidy on your electricity to be able to pump water onto your wheat. But then they have incredibly interesting political kind of powers, and that was encouraging wheat production, but it was making it harder to produce potatoes, because aphids were coming in at the wrong time, and that meant they would hit the potato crop and decimate the potato crop, because they were cutting down the cereals. The seasons are whack out there because they'll get 2 seasons of potatoes as well, because they can pretty much grow crops all year round. So it's really interesting about that government connection, and then being able to provide subsidies to shift from wheat or rice into potatoes, and also the scope and opportunity for global investment. They're sitting with a population of 1.3 billion, and they're also on the doorstep of China, who are going to be a big purchaser of food, as they can't sustain their own need for food. So I think India, they're positioning themselves as being a bit of the breadbasket of Asia, and they certainly have the potential of that. So Kenya, 51 million and growing. I think Nairobi, where I went to visit, there's about a population of nearly 5 million, and it's growing by 4% every year. So the population is pretty big, and people who want food, production is fairly small in comparison at 1.3 million. So it has very low production to population ratio, but land that has the capacity to grow efficient crops, and consumer that is looking for new food chains. And I'll discuss this later on about the food chains and the opportunities. There is investment in infrastructure at a local level, introducing new varieties that can stand up to climate and pest disease pressures while meeting consumer expectations. The pest and disease, I think I'll talk about this later as well, but it's really important to understand protecting land, especially this is pretty fertile land that I saw in the areas I went to, although obviously Kenya is a big country, but actually being able to protect land from pest and disease is really important. And then Brazil, I wanted to go to Brazil because I thought it would be a country that would be large scale and really innovative, because we hear a lot about other sectors doing good jobs in Brazil. It had opened up its market, and that they'd come to Scotland to open up markets to be able to invest and bring seed across. And that was something that was fairly new across there, and they were very reliant on the American market for seed. And they wanted to kind of de-risk that about 4 or 5 years ago. And I wanted to see how they were investing and whether seed was actually getting across to Brazil, and that was changing their systems. It's slow progress, but there's huge potential in what's happening in Brazil. And then Chile, well, I went to Chile because pretty much just because it was in South America, and I wanted to see other systems while I was there. I hadn't actually expected it to be a place that was producing potatoes like it was, and as commercially and as efficiently. I've told a few people that if I wanted land anywhere, I'd want that land in Chile, because the soil structure was incredible. A lot of the systems were really similar to what I work with here in Scotland. So the planting and the harvesting were pretty similar. However, I went and I saw the planters, and we were kind of climbing all over the planter and talking about what was going on, and it was big machinery, much bigger machinery than I expected. So I asked them about compaction, how do they deal with compaction? And they just looked at me like I was really silly. I got that a lot, Lucas, if you're silly because you asked silly questions. And they made me to start digging the soil, and it was literally, I mean, I didn't dig meters, but you couldn't find any compaction, you couldn't find a pan. It was just like it was in such long grass rotations. Plenty of land, good climate, access to water. It was just phenomenal. But I'll introduce some of the issues that they have in Chile later on. But in terms of land, and in a beautiful country, but it was an amazing place to learn what was going on there, and kind of one that was a bit more unexpected. And in the USA, I thought I needed to kind of see what was happening in America. You kind of get a mixed picture. So just to try and understand what's going on. And I think probably it's really difficult to summarize just what's happening in America, because there's so much diversity. Each region kind of operates differently, and obviously potatoes aren't growing everywhere. But I was able to go to the Potato Expo, which was in Vegas in January. And it kind of gave me an insight of what was going on, probably more in terms of the research and the breeding and the programs that were going on there. But they obviously are a really well-established market. They've been eating potatoes, I don't know since when. They probably brought them from Ireland. But the population is massive. The GDP and the disposable income and spend on food is huge as well in comparison to any of the other countries I've been to. And production was pretty vast as well at 20 million, but again, nowhere near where you are with India and China. It is highly developed, but what I found was a lot of it is predominantly focused on high inputs and high output systems, and there's abundance of land, and the pressure on land use is nowhere the same as what we have here, which I think probably shapes how they approach potato production. And like I said, each state kind of operates separately, and a lot of the information and the framework that they have, the USDA is an incredibly powerful organisation, and has a huge amount of resource. I mean, not specifically to potatoes, but I got a chance to go to the Senate, and we met senators, and we met with the USDA, and we met with the export team, and the man who led on plant health, and the man who led on trade deals. And they talked to us about what was going on in agriculture and what were the issues and stuff. And one of the kind of scary things was that they were talking about forecasting and understanding how much they needed to buy against what needs sold. And they were talking about the China-America trade deal. And they kind of, I don't know if it's common knowledge or if it's what the kind of situation is with that, but they talked about that they could forecast what was going to be produced in, well, probably Scotland and in anywhere in Russia or any part of the world. They could forecast because of the satellites and the crop monitoring systems that they have. They could forecast harvest before most countries would ever even publish figures. So they know what's going on. They've got incredible crop modelling systems and an access to huge amounts of research. And a lot of that is then channeled through the universities as well. So in terms of knowledge and kind of scope of knowledge, USA is amazing. It's just slightly fragmented or difficult to understand exactly what was happening in each state. And then the Netherlands feeds the world. And in terms of potatoes, they really do dominate everywhere I went to. People knew all about Dutch seed. In India, they were investing in processing plants. And they really are seen as a world leader in terms of food production. And I think they hit so much harder, like the impact that the Netherlands has in the world is huge. They're the second biggest exporter in terms of value in the world, and that's behind America. And that's in terms of total export, and a lot of that is food. I find that they're really pragmatic in their approach to pest and disease management, and their marketing is so powerful and positive. Land is really expensive there as well, and their attention to detail on using that land is probably what drives such success. Although interestingly, the production figures have been decreasing, and they expect that to be a trend that will continue. So then we'll go on to the environment, and I think we'll do a quiz first just to check you're all still here with me. So, which crop uses the most water, ordering from highest to lowest?
Yeah, and if you think about the grain, maize grain, wheat grain, you can get a false impression that because it's so dry, therefore it doesn't need a lot of water to grow it.
Obviously timing comes into it, doesn't it? But in terms of total water needed, yeah. And often I think people like wheat and cereals are perceived, because a lot of broadacre farms in like South Australia and things, you'd assume that it doesn't need much water.
Yes, you associate wheat in Australia, don't you, with very dry, dusty conditions.
Yeah. Interesting.
Well, when we've all seen pictures of paddy fields,
yeah.
So you would think that.
I don't know if you noticed the picture on the slide before, but it was me with an ox ploughing a paddy field. There was plenty of water there. And it's interesting because the water is used to manage pest and disease, isn't it? It's really to almost well, it's to manage pest and disease, because it saturates the soil, doesn't it? And literally, we were turning soil and water into soup. It was mad how you the cultivation techniques. We think we're harsh on soils,
and they deliberately destroy soil structure, don't they, in order to produce the right conditions for a particular type of rice.
Yeah.
Well,
potatoes not scoring too well here.
Rice followed by potatoes seems pretty stable. People are not so sure on maize and wheat.
Maize and wheat.
So are you going to give us the answer, Claire?
We'll get the answers, will we? I'll switch over. So here we go. So in terms of calories to water use, rice is your highest. So I'll get this right. Rice is your least efficient. Wheat is your next least efficient. Maize and then potatoes are actually your best in terms of calories per volume of water. So I think it's just potatoes that were in the wrong place there. So I'll go to the environment, and I think that's probably what I wanted, because in terms of the potato, we often don't think of it as being an environmentally friendly or sustainable product, and actually it's got so much to offer in terms of sustainability in comparison to rice and wheat, or rice and pasta, with a really low base production of CO2, and it's really pretty water efficient, and that's something we have to kind of capture and get the message across more.
We hear quite often of growers in this country who are having difficulty getting land to rent to grow potatoes because people have got the idea that it's going to damage the soil, rightly or wrongly. What's being done around the world to minimise any damage due to potatoes and give the crop a good reputation environmentally?
So I think something that is really interesting when I went to and I briefly mentioned earlier about no-till potatoes, but and not cultivating the land, and in India what they were doing, and this was a SIP project, which is the international International Centre of Potatoes, isn't it? The acronym's the wrong way around, but it's in Spanish. CIP, and they were doing a project in India to look at no-till, and they were using it, actually, they were using the rice paddy once it's harvested, and using the paddy as a substrate to grow the potatoes in. And this was mostly to do with trying to get land that wouldn't have been suitable for potatoes. So rather than trying to find solutions in terms of mechanization, what they were doing was finding solutions in terms of substrate, and using the substrate that they already had, rice paddy, and kind of folding that over and growing the potatoes within that rice paddy as a substrate. And that was really pretty amazing. And I'll talk again a bit about it later, but it's finding those solutions. And I hear people talked about how you couldn't do that because, well, how would you harvest the crop? But while I was in India, and I met the Grimmy dealer in India, and he was saying, well, we'll just have to design a harvester that can do the job. So it's kind of about challenging what we thought can't be done. And then, and is there things that the potato can offer, but we're not actually tapping into? And as we know, the consumer has got a lot to say about the environment, which is rightfully so. But what can we do to kind of say, well, actually, no, the potato is good as a plant for this, and what can we do that's better? And there's a lot of work as well, which was really exciting from last week, about looking after your soils, your organic matter, being part of a rotation. But I think that in terms of the environmental message for potatoes, it's something that we should be a lot stronger in, and tapping into, and working out ways that we can demonstrate the best practice in terms of looking after our soils. So I'm going to talk a bit about the man in the picture here, because this is Matomi, who I met in Kenya, and he was quite an incredible farmer, and I think he probably was one of the most interesting meetings I had, just because he changed the way I probably asked questions of myself, and also questions of maybe what could we do differently at home. So he was a neighbour of a broadacre farmer who I'd gone to visit in this area, and he'd said, you must meet my neighbour who's got 5 acres and he lives around the corner. So I went to go and visit this man, Matomi, and he showed me around his meticulous 5 acres of land, and it was just incredible. We started at the lagoon, which took up 1 acre, and it was a lined lagoon. He was breeding fish and selling the fish as well, breeding and selling fish from his lagoon. He was even selling the algae from the top of the lagoon. And this was fundamentally, the lagoon was there to irrigate his potatoes, because the potatoes were his main crop on his 5 acres. He had a rotation of 4 crops. He used maize actually as a kind of intercrop around that as well. And he'd get 2, if not 3 crops of potatoes in 1 year on the 1 acre, and then he'd give it a break using the rotation. He had some cattle, and he used he had about 3 cattle, I think it was, and he would use that for milk, but also he'd use the manure from the cattle. He'd actually put it in a tank, and he'd catch the methane off the manure to fire for energy in the kitchen. And then he composted, and he had quite an elaborate composting system where he moved the compost through and churned it in kind of like a weekly basis, to make sure that he could feed that organic matter back into the field. He knew every single piece of land on acres. It was absolutely incredible. The yields he was getting, and I think he was getting about 18 tonnes per acre, which was pretty high, and that was double what most people were getting in that area. And a lot of that was to do with looking after the soil, but also about getting varieties that could yield better. And that was one of his main drivers, was getting the right varieties so he could get more profit from each piece of land. One of the things that he probably was a bit behind on and was trying to understand better is how to store his crop, because previously he'd always had to sell it directly into the market, and without having that buffer of storage. And also he didn't have he was just using a kind of equivalent of, coal shed to store his seed potatoes. But he was constantly thinking about, how do I make this better, how do I make it integrate into my system, and what do I do next? So I sat down with him at the end of it, and he was clearly capable of farming much bigger acreages than if he was across here, he'd be farming thousands of acres. He'd be an agronomist covering huge counties of potatoes. So I asked him, when does he get bigger and when does he do more? And he looked at me and said, again, as if I was crazy, and said, I don't want to get bigger. If I get bigger, I won't be as good and I can still be better at what I'm doing here. And it really resonated with me, because I think often when we're thinking about with potato production, it's often how do we get more from being bigger, as opposed to what could we get more from this piece of land that we've got? Have we used everything to its fullest, and is there more that we can put into it to create more efficiency within that cycle? So I really enjoyed that visit, and it was an amazing way to see someone think differently to what I'd been used to. So now I'm going to take you a bit into the markets of what the countries I went to. I think there's a couple of questions coming in, but we'll see if Anne comes on. I'm going to ask you to think about what is the percentage of certified seed planted each year around the world.
And while people are thinking, there's a really interesting question come in. From your experience, Claire, and what you've learned around the world, what do you think is the greatest improvement that potato agronomists could recommend to their clients in the UK?
I mean, I think, there's so much in there. There's so much to think about. I think ultimately looking at what are the requirements of the consumer, and what can we do better with, how can we deliver that better and more efficiently. So not specific, use this product, it's actually being able to have those conversations about what do I want to achieve, and then how does that then look. So who is my consumer? What supply chain do I want to be part of? How do I share information better? I think it's a lot about those conversations and bringing tools to, or solutions to, farmers. I think that's what people are looking for from, because businesses are so big now and people have only got so much space to think about everything. So I think an agronomist role is much more holistic now than ever, or needs to be more holistic in terms of understanding that profile and expectation of the business that you're delivering to. But I wish I could say, oh, it's a product.
We'd all like that.
It's not as easy as that. There's no silver bullet.
But that question and your answer relates to another question. Of all the countries you've visited, which one can we learn the most from? Which is offering that market-oriented, integrated approach?
I think I probably saw a lot of that in India, and that kind of, especially when I went to the potato conclave, which was there, and it was really exciting talking to young people there. And I think that's probably where it was really refreshing, of people just saying, well, yeah, we can do this, because potatoes are kind of in their infancy as a kind of whole industry. And so, yeah, I think we can learn a lot from there, and especially because of their access to kind of data handling, because data handling, the world kind of uses India as a kind of hub for data handling. A lot of stuff, tools that we use and technology that's around. I know we think of China as being the ones that are kind of building it, but in terms of data technology and programming and stuff, there's a lot of access to that there. And I think they're embracing that more than where I've seen elsewhere. And perhaps it was just because I was at the conclave and elsewhere I was on farm. But I thought India was a really interesting place in terms of integrating that data handling, that different way of approaching systems, and also young people kind of being able to drive some of those conversations.
Well, in this country, we have some choice about which supply chain a farmer wants to produce for. Many constraints around it, but there are choices. Do you think in India that the farmers are choosing the supply chain, or is the drive the other way round, that the supply chain is very powerful and it can pick which areas, which farmers it wants to work with?
I think there's probably a bit of a mix of both. There's still a very kind of local trade there in terms of kind of probably smaller scale farmers, and that's very local and there won't be much choice or option. But one of the businesses I saw, which is Sanga Seeds, which was like absolutely incredible. I think if it's a dynamic and progressive, I think there's huge amounts of opportunity. So I think there's kind of a two-tier system at the moment there.
Right, thanks Claire. Now we've got the results up.
Okay, so percentage of seed planted a year around the world. So no one thinks it's less than 5%. What have we got? 75 to 85%, 10%, 5 to 10%, 60%. Oh, they're on the ball with this one. So the answer is correct, is between 5 to 10%, which I think is particularly low. And bearing in mind, I don't know if I've got it in here, but the UK is around about 80%. So if you think about the law of averages, the amount of certified seed available to people is really incredibly low. And I think for me that's a concern, but it's also a huge opportunity because we produce really good seed and we also demonstrate the infrastructure that pulls that together and creates a really strong supply chain. So I'm going to just take a moment to talk about James Narodi, who I met here in the field. He was a first generation farmer again in Kenya. And the reason I found him because he was talking lots on Twitter about potatoes and talking about high grade seed in Kenya. So I dropped him a message on Twitter and I just met him in the field on my road trip around the country. And he was amazing. He'd set up the business himself. He understood that there was a gap in the market. While we were there, he had his customers, so local farmers who would have small area farms. But he wanted to show to them how the benefits of his high grade seed and the quality of it. So he wanted them to be there at each stage to show them how do you plant, how do you prepare the land, what kind of yield you get from it, and that they could trust the product that they were seeing. It was also a sneaky way of getting people to do work for you without paying for you and then getting them to pay for the product. I thought it was ingenious. If only we could do that. But it was amazing what he was doing. The attention to detail, the understanding of the importance of the process. He was actually using apical cuttings, which is quite well supported out there, especially by the Potato Council, an initiative that's done by SIP as well. So that's taking cutting as opposed to a mini tuber. So it was really interesting what he was doing. But here he was, he also, these were researchers for one of the universities, and that was him showing them what was needed to develop his business, what science was needed, where the gaps were, and how he could support them as well. So they travelled 3 hours to come and visit him and learn from what he was doing, and I thought that was amazing. And I think it's really important that we get scientists and researchers out on the farm to ask the questions of what can they do to support and what information do we need to progress. However, interestingly, when I was speaking to James, one of the most important things, or one of the biggest issues for him, he was good at the supply chain, he could understand how to engage and stuff, but what he found with being a first generation farmer was that access to money was one of his biggest challenges. And I suppose it's one of those things that it's shared all around the world. If you can't access money, you can't develop a business, and that was where he was finding it was difficult, as he just rented the land a year at a time, and he needed investment to be able to develop it further. But it was amazing what he was doing, and incredible, that vision of how he could see he could bring people together to not just forward his own business, but forward that value of a certified seed or a certified product that could help communities as well, not just his own business.
Claire, this really is the point to ask how we can get more involved with these countries abroad. The UK has got an excellent certification system. What stops us being able to access more of the global market to improve the proportion of certified seed that's used around the world?
Yeah, I think this is something that you see done really well in the Netherlands. So, like, they're being able to access these markets and being able to get in. A lot of it's to do with promoting the product that we have. It's also being able to empower the growers. So there's lots of education that needs to be done as well to show what the potential is. But ultimately, I think where the biggest value is breeding and breeding technologies and breeding new varieties. Because I think that the biggest advantage is being able, because especially in Kenya, PCN would be an issue. The awareness of the pest and disease is often quite low, but the impact can be really high. So knowing whether you've not got PCN might be quite low down on your awareness of what's caused the low yields with some of these farmers. So I think it's being able to get varieties that quickly give results, and I think that's where the importance is getting varieties out there that can get us results, and then open up a really strong market too. And that's why breeding programs are so important.
What if a country has had lack of certified seed and pest or disease has got into the soil, and you were mentioning PCN in Kenya? Once they've got an entrenched problem, can certified seed help them get out of that situation? And the same applies to us here, because we've got some entrenched problems.
I think it's really difficult to go backwards. So I was talking about land in Chile where they've had long grass rotations. I'd say the most important thing is never to get into that problem. So that's often the barrier to get into markets, because of indigenous pests and disease that we would have, and they would. I mean, I don't. Often some of the countries don't know the levels of PCN that they would have, and then would say that they don't have pest and disease in the country because there isn't the diagnostics available. But so my first thing would be don't get into the situation, and the second would be get varieties that can help clean things up. But we all know how difficult that is, and connect the variety to the market.
Well, now you've raised a really interesting topic there, Claire. How do you get new varieties taken up which have got resistance to pests and diseases? And there's so many obstacles here. It's happening, but not as fast as we'd like. Did you get any tips from around the world on how new varieties with better resistance can be introduced and taken up?
Who was doing that well to get varieties in? I think often, I'll tell you about George, who's here on the screen. Actually, I'll go and talk about what he's doing and what's happening in Nairobi with crisps. So this is George, who was he worked at the Syngenta Foundation, and in Kenya. And he talked to me about the importance of actually accessing a market and being able to find those opportunities. And I think probably what we've seen during COVID is about that need for agility and being able to respond to what's going on. And George was showing me about how in Nairobi, again, the increasing population, but he was saying that local hand-cooked crisps have become really popular. And this was them marketing them in the local supermarket where I met him. So it was ultimately important to find a variety that could feed into that, but they were using kind of mostly Dutch varieties or European varieties that would allow them to get into a market really quickly because of low investment needed to get there, and it was responding directly to what consumers wanted. And I thought that was a really kind of neat way to get into a market to do exactly what people wanted. And I think we often end up quite stuck in the chain and the processes, and we separate ourselves from the end user. And I suppose it's been really nice over COVID. I mean, there's been terrible things, but the rise of kind of farm shops and potatoes sold on farm, it won't completely change or radicalize the potato industry, but it's really nice to see how we can move quickly and respond to what people want. Fortunately, what people wanted in Nairobi, it was at high volume, so people could get into it really quickly, and it was really nice. So I'm just going to take a moment to talk about nutrition in potatoes. It's more just to raise a point or a question. Because one of the questions that I got a lot was about the nutritional benefits of potatoes. And I always think, what's the role of the agronomist in this? Because I think it's really important that we actually have a product that is healthy, and that starts with the crop and the plant and the soil. So this was a really, really cool marketing campaign done by Potatoes USA, and it was Potatoes for Performance, and they created a whole website, and it's amazing, talking about how healthy potatoes are, how great they are for cycling, how great they are for any sport really. But it was just really interesting and quirky. I've never seen anything done like that. And I think even if you look at what's been happening over the last few weeks, they're talking about how potatoes potential to reduce anemia because of the levels of link in it. Zinc, and then also diabetes, a friendly meal. And then at AHDB, we've got a marketing campaign on baked potatoes, because baked potatoes provide loads of fibre. But the important thing is that we have the continuity of the product, and we've got the assurance that the potatoes that we're producing are healthy. And I think that's something that we've probably forgotten a bit about at the kind of base layer of what are we putting into the product and what are we getting out. And often, I mean, we all know varieties which hopefully are a bit more past us, but varieties that are full of water and don't taste very good. But what else do they have in there? And do they have all this nutritious stuff that's great for our consumer, and we can really promote the potato further? I hope this becomes much more part of the agronomist's role in making sure that we measure the nutrition of the product before it even leaves the farm. So then technology. I hope you all appreciate this photo. There was a man that stood on the back of that sprayer while it was spraying, and it was just a tin can that was the barrel. So it was quite special to watch that operating in a field. So question 5, and this is the final section. So as an agronomist, which technology are you most interested in?
Well, Claire, I'm a little disappointed in our audience who haven't been producing as many questions as I thought they might. And I would encourage everybody to think if you were in a room with Claire, effectively you are, what question would you like to ask her about the Nuffield Scholarship and the relevance of all those experiences to the UK? It's a good chance to grab her. Oh, this
is interesting.
Good.
So we've got neck and neck, plant breeding technology and plant husbandry, and then data sharing. Oh. Okay. So I'm going to go into the final piece of my presentation. Final piece of the presentation. And I'm going to talk about technology, but ultimately I'm kind of going to pose a question or pose an idea that was put forward to me by somebody, and I'm going to kind of talk through it. And I hope this kind of provokes some thoughts in your mind of whether it's possible, whether we should be doing it, or whether you're absolutely against it. So let me pose, it's just kind of a bit of a fun, but it's a real idea. It's a real person actually doing this. So I'll talk to you about it. Okay, so thinking about the challenges on farm, I've kind of separated it out into profit, customer, environment. And this is an agronomist. These are your challenges. How do you respond to inputs, waste, labour, subsidies, competition, water waste? There's lots being thrown, and we know we're constantly, this week, a lot of it's about chemical loss. How do we respond to that? With announcements from government about carbon and environment and what our role and responsibilities are there. So we're constantly be thrown at challenges, and it's hard, it's difficult. So I spoke to a farmer who was in Canada, and he kind of asked me some questions, or posed what he was doing about how he saw the future of the potato industry. He recognised, or he worked in a business who were marketing salad potatoes. So it was going into the American market. It has a high value, So high return, high profitability, high risk because of the growing processes in place, but also it's to a consumer who are willing to pay for a premium product. So therefore they are engaged in the story behind the product, and therefore there's a premium to be had if you make the story match up. So what was he going to do? We spoke about the supply chain and the connectivity in it, and how, and I talked earlier about how this is, this is a kind of piece of art, a skill to be able to produce the potato. But he explained and talked about it and said, well, if you were going to design the production system of a potato, would you design it like this? Because to us, it's perfection. But is it perfection? Because it's so complicated and it takes so long. Can we make this more efficient? And obviously we find efficiencies along the way, but can we kind of throw this out and start again? Because if you try and explain to a customer or a consumer that it takes 8 years to get a potato to your table, it just sounds ridiculous. So he talked to me about disruptive technology, which is true seed, and it is disruptive. It will change everything. Removing the perceived challenges and turning these into opportunities. The use of more diverse cultivars in the field reduces risks of pest and disease. So because you have more diversity, using the true seed, you can either use them as seedlings or you can plant the seed into the field. It removes all the need for years of multiplication. It also removes the need for transporting of bulky seed potatoes. I asked at the American conference about what were they going to do if True Seed takes on, and they said they couldn't because they were shipping potatoes from Maine to Colorado. The distances that they move potatoes, especially seed, are vast. And so I asked what would they do, and they told me that they couldn't possibly do this because it would be too difficult to count seeds, and they use a potato counter. And if that's what's holding you back to change your system, there's a problem in your system. So this guy was talking about true seed and the opportunities, and the true seed can play a vital role. I'll take a moment to kind of describe how true seed would work, because you'd end up, he was talking about using seed that would break your monoculture in your field, so you'd have lots of genetics within your field. So if you'd have plants that were all growing at different rates, you would have different resistance to pests and diseases, which will cause lots of hassle, but it also create loads of opportunity, because if an aphid comes in, or if a disease hits your field, blight or blackleg or anything comes in, you've got resistance and variation among the field, which will protect the field as a whole, and you might only lose a small percentage, or you can target your approach to a small percentage. So I think it's a really interesting approach, but it completely changes how we think about a field should look, because we go by the process of thinking everything should look the same and uniform, and then we can manage it. Essentially, we've just multiplied what we understand by small scale. I can do that, so let's make it big scale and keep everything absolutely the same, which is easier to control. But if we want to turn those challenges into opportunities, we need to think about this differently. So if we turn this round, we create these as opportunities, because if we use the benefits of nature in terms of diversity with a plant, we can manage water better, we can reduce waste, we have better efficiency with pest and disease, we give the customer everything they were asking for because we have the product they want, we reduce the waste, we can give them the nutrition that we're looking for, so we can concentrate on different things, and we can shift this around to being a really positive situation and positive message. So what's the solutions? How do we manage this? We have to transition to a whole field to an individual plant management, and this needs to respond to the soil, the plant, the microclimate, the rotation, and the market. And I think this is where it gets exciting, because we transition from whole market to individual plant management, and that means that we're going to have to use a lot of the tools that we have sitting on the shelf at the moment. And often when we look at some of the tools that we can use, we don't have enough diversity within the field to actually be able to test a lot of the processes and the information. Whereas if we use this technology on a field that has lots of different stuff going on, we can actually get the technology to be better. And I think that's really exciting. So we can look at engineering, we can look at automation, we can look at robotics, and we can look at machine learning. I think machine learning will be a real big thing to watch out for in the future, because we can't, as agronomists, you can't watch a field that's changing all over the place. And I think that's the reason that we've taken the approach we have, is that it's much easier to manage something that looks the same. So we can't see these changes by our eye, and we're going to have to use tools and technology to support us making those decisions. And it's going to be equally important to be able to translate that. So you're still going to need people to actually translate it, and the expertise of agronomists is going to change, but it doesn't mean it's going to be less important. And then here's where the important bit is that integration into the networks of information. How do you communicate ideas with your network? How do you create those strategic partnerships, and what digital platforms do you use to be able to, for you to access that and make change happen? And this fundamentally goes to what the role of the agronomist is. You are the integrator in that supply chain process. You need to communicate, you need to help exchange information in that strategic relationship, and use tools that are at your fingertips. And I'll skip over this because we're taking a bit of time, but it's just this understanding of everything's connected, and think about how it's connected to the environment, how it's connected to your community, and how it's connected to the businesses that you're operating with. I'm not going to labour this point because I feel like we're kind of running out of time, and it'd be nice to get some more questions, but I hope a lot of you were able to see the session that we ran last week. So to recap a little bit, the true seed is an opportunity, and it's a different way of thinking about things, and it would completely radicalise where we would go in the future. I don't think it's going to be the solution for all of us, but I think it's really exciting to think differently and to be like, how could we remove a lot of the challenges and turn them into opportunities by using tools and expertise that we have at hand. And we need to stop thinking about that supply chain being, how do we want that supply chain to look, and how can we take some of that complexity out of it, and so that we can really deliver on product and continue to do a good job. I'd just like to highlight, because I think Brendan Rocky presented last week at the potato industry event, and it was a phenomenal way of how he was actually doing this. He was changing the way you grow potatoes, or he grows potatoes, and it was really admirable, and it was really exciting to listen to how he actually explains the processes within his business and how things can look differently. And I really recommend that you have a watch of these videos. It's about 1 hour and 45, but you can fast forward to the good bits. But he looks at integrated pest management for aphids, mechanical weeding, and cover crop grazing. And it's all about breaking that monoculture within a field and changing the way we think about how that field should look and how we should manage it. And that's my challenge to agronomists, is what do we want this to look like, and where do we want it to go? And we're all part of a community, and the role of the agronomist is really strong. So thinking about opportunities for the UK agriculture, connectivity is a mindset, not a process, and it's all about drawing out that knowledge and experience and moving forward and developing the future of our industry to secure it for ourselves and the future. Strategic supplier segmentation, agronomists are crucial. Network approach, again, agronomists, you're part of that network, you are part of this change, but we need to be connected to that market, and if we're not part of the market, we're not going anywhere. So we need to look after it. So thank you very much. I feel like I've thrown an awful lot at you all.
We have a number of questions now, Claire, over a range of
I was wondering if I was just talking to myself.
Certainly not. Taking what you've just been speaking about first, and the true seed, how could we here add more genetic variation to the field without making harvest difficult? Would a buyer accept multiple varieties, or would they need to be sorted?
So I think my understanding of it is the potato wouldn't be different. It would just be, so the product would be similar. It would just be a case of managing the size and the spec of it.
And then a related question, did the potatoes from True Seed all make market spec?
Well, that's the challenge. So that's what this farmer in Canada is trying to develop. So at the moment, I didn't see the fields because it was a phone call conversation I had with him. I think at the moment it's almost at that impossibility stage. It works when you're kind of doing small scale and you can see every plant as an individual. But his ambition is to be able to replicate at large scale. So there's loads of opportunity when you look at like Kenyan and Indian systems, which are smaller. But this Canadian farmer, he's absolute that he's going to be able to do it, but it's going to be a case of implementing the technology. So being able to manage each plant using technology. So that'll be using satellite mapping, it'll be soil mapping beforehand as well to understand how. So looking at growth bulking rates and things like that, so you'll be able to burn down at different stages as well. So it's going to be a case of throwing the bucket of technology at it to get it to work.
Something to try and follow.
I hope I get to see what he's done, but he ran a big business in America and said he was going to do it. So I think these are the stories we need to watch to learn from.
Yes. Well, now, a whole range of other questions. I'll start with the one that's about you personally. What made you want to do a Nuffield, and what advice would you give for an agronomist thinking of one?
So I'd say absolutely do one. What made me do one? I think it's one of those things as well. Like, if I'm honest, I thought about doing it, or I heard good things about it when I was younger, and then thought, actually, I don't know what I would study, and I don't think I can do it because I don't know what topic, or I don't know how I would do it, or I didn't think I'd get through the application process. And then I think what triggered me into actually being like, okay, I'm going to fill out this form. I think I had it half filled out when I was about 25, and then took me to a little bit older to actually complete it. I was working with farmers and we were looking at issues around blackleg, and the third inspection came in. And I could see every side of the story. I could see every side of the argument because I was talking and working with lots of different people. And there was just a huge amount of frustration in how do we move forward with something and still promote the industry because it's still a great product. And that made me kind of search for answers. And I thought Nuffield would give me an opportunity to see, kind of sit back and understand what was actually going on. And actually, in reflection, it's made me value what we do here an awful lot. And it's really nice to kind of come back home and be like, we do a really good job. So yeah, that's probably a long story of why I did a Nuffield. But if anyone wants to talk to me about Nuffield or opportunities, please do. And also I've talked, like, just keep looking out for opportunities in terms of we do the Next Generation program with AHDB, joining up to programs to be able to see how people do things differently and not just in potatoes it's made such a difference to me through my career so far. So yeah, please do talk to me if you've got specifics. But the Nuffield program is unbelievable. It's so good. And it's, yeah.
Well, it's interesting that it was a problem, and looking at how to tackle blackleg, which led you on to thinking whether there might be help in that search from abroad. And we're certainly not short of other problems to tackle. And one of the questions is, how can we, as agronomists, help improve the reputation of potatoes? They are often seen as unhealthy.
Sorry, I missed that bit, Anne. Sorry.
How can we, as agronomists, help improve the reputation of potatoes? They are often seen as unhealthy.
So I think in terms of like promotion and talking, the world's a lot smaller in terms of like social media and all that sort of thing. I think we all play a role in that. I think probably my plea to agronomists is to think, what can we offer on that kind of terms of plant health and the nutrition that is being transferred through? I think there's a lot more that can be offered as that, and that's a real kind of, I mean, it'd be very much niche, but I'd like to think that agronomists were thinking about the product as being a healthy, nutritious food. It's like a medicine. you know, that, and I think that should be the mindset of us all working in the industry, is that this is something for health of people. It's not just a product that we need to get through the next chain in the supply chain. We don't finish the job when it goes to the pack house. We don't finish the job when the consumer picks it up on the shelf. And often we consider that when it comes to the aesthetics of the potato, but we don't think about it as when it comes to and we sometimes think about when it comes to the taste experience, but we don't think about it in terms of the nutrition. And I think the agronomists can really change that whole cycle, and they've got so much power in that cycle.
Well, we all enjoy eating potatoes ourselves, and I don't know that we make the most of that to just talk to our friends and family.
And social media. It'd be really interesting to have a little, like, you know, how can you get a blog out to people from an agronomist talking about all the great stuff that's happening in the soil and how you look after the crops and the plants. We don't often get that perception or that picture across to people. So I think there's definitely more, and people are really interested. People are so interested in where their food comes from.
So if you have time left over from learning how to be a good agronomist, there is scope for you in promoting the
Get
product
some videos
as well.
Video diary next summer. I'm looking forward to seeing some.
Now, some more questions. You talked about no-till. What would we need to fit potatoes into a no-till system in the UK?
Yeah, so actually there's a project going to happen at James Hutton. It was supposed to happen this year, but it didn't because of COVID. They're going to try and pilot a scheme to do no-till, and I certainly don't think so essentially you'd have to take I said it was paddy, so rice paddy. You could use straw. They were going to use a kind of grass mulch to grow the potatoes in, and then you just kind of place the potatoes in a field within that, and a lot of it they talked about kind of you'd grow a secondary crop between the rows, and then I don't know, in my mind it's like a silage that you put over the potatoes and you grow the potato within that, so it's properly on top of ground, and then you'd harvest the potatoes. But they're going to pilot that scheme in at the James Hutton this summer, or 2021. So it'll be really interesting to see how that works. The people in India that were actually doing it, they said the skin finish was really good, which I'd imagined the skin finish would be terrible, thinking about exposure. But they said the skin finish was good, but I think greens would be the biggest issue. But what we're talking about is it's not really large scale production for no-till. It would be like either early generations or if you wanted your pre-basic. I'm not suggesting the pre-basic growers this becomes the absolute future, but I think it's about some of the specialist needs for potatoes in terms of pest and disease management. You can do it in areas where land wouldn't be suitable. I think it opens up options, and when we're losing options, it's important to try and explore different opportunities.
Thank you. Back to the role of the agronomist. In the countries you visited, was the relationship between grower and agronomist similar to that in the UK? Were either of them involved in different elements apart from that of growing the crop?
So I'd say in likes of Chile, it was very similar to how we operate here. I'd say probably when I was in the likes of Kenya and India, probably most so, a lot of the information would come direct from the chemical suppliers. So there wouldn't be the role of the independent agronomist. And so it'd be quite patchy, the information that was coming through. There'd be the likes of the Kenyan Potato Council, but again, really limited to what they can deliver because funds really small, because for that it has to come through kind of government routes as well. So in terms of the relationships with agronomists, I think we're we've got some of the strongest support networks and systems, and being able to get that diversity of opinion is really important. So I think we're in a real privileged situation to be able to have that sense of voice amongst our agronomists and advisors within the industry, which is really, really important. But as I say, in Chile, they operate a pretty similar approach. As saying about the numbers of growers, we're talking in Kenya alone, it was 30,000 growers, and we have less than 2,000. So the number of people you have to speak to, imagine having that list, a client list, would be quite phenomenal, wouldn't it?
Thank you. And we're nearly at the end of time. One last question. What was the biggest thing you learnt on your adventures, and how has it changed your outlook for AHDB and its provision going forward?
So I think the biggest thing, I mean, I'll probably sound like I'm just saying what everybody else is talking about, but when I met Matomi about, and that kind of, that looking after the land you've got and looking after the opportunities you have within that system, I think it is really, really important. And I think I probably heard it a lot before, but when you saw someone so optimistically doing it and successfully, I was really blown away. And I suppose that was why I was keen for Brendan Rocky to come and speak to us last week, because he'd completely embraced that already, like way beyond people were talking about it over here. So yeah, that would definitely be my kind of, it's about looking at some of these wild ideas and seeing if we can make them happen here. And that's probably, I'm not saying I'm going to bring all the wild ideas to AHDB, but I think it's probably, to me, it's asking the questions and asking the researchers, what could they do? Asking the farmers, what can we do on the spot farms? And we were already doing that, and it's really exciting. And it's kind of asking well, what's the potential? And let's turn those challenges into opportunities. And I think that's what I think the role of like us and like people coming into industry, it's asking what can we do and why is this, and is there a different way of doing it? And I'll probably just keep asking that.
Right. Well, thanks again. It has been a long session, Claire, for you, and I'm sure we've all gained different things from it. In my case, it's a feeling that we tend to look to the Netherlands and perhaps North America for ideas, but in fact there is innovation everywhere, and we need to keep an eye on it, because countries seen as low-tech can leapfrog us, and they need to be followed as well. So watch out for the basis and NROSO codes, and then there's a very interesting session at 11 o'clock on nematodes. Thank you. Goodbye.